Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Nun bitten wir den Heiligen Geist, which translates to, we now beg the Holy Spirit. Now this is a dense chorale. We have a lot to unpack here, just as far as harmonic real estate is concerned, but thankfully it's pretty much entirely functionally harmonic, so there aren't too many twists and turns that Bach throws us for here. There's just a lot of subdivision going on, so especially in the first system, which is visually more compact than the second system, we're going to spend a while really looking at each individual eighth note subdivision of the measure to see if there are chords to be unpacked, and in many cases there are. So starting off with the key signature, we have three sharps. We start on A, we end on A. We're pretty much in the key of A major for this entire chorale. Not a lot of modulations actually, proportionately to the harmonic movement of the chorale. This isn't an exceptionally long chorale, so I don't know if I would expect any more modulations than there are in this particular harmonization, but that being said, with the density, it feels like there's a lot more harmonic activity proportionate in this chorale than in a chorale of similar length that Bach has, the earlier chorales that we've looked at is what I'm trying to say. So we start off with our one chord. We have G sharp, B, E, and B. That's E major over G sharp, which is 5/6. Some passing tones in the lower voices. Don't really get a chord there. F sharp, A, E, and B. Then we get C sharp, G sharp, E, and E, G sharp, E, and B. That's taking our chord and putting it in root position. We'll just change the figured bass, passing seventh in the bass as well before we get C sharp, A, E, and A. That's our tonic triad in first inversion. This A, kind of like putting the chord in root position, but because we're getting rid of the third of the chord, that leaves the rest of the chord not intact. So I'll talk about it, but I will not put it down on the page. We then have D, B, D, and G sharp. That's G sharp diminished over D, which is 7/6/4. However, you could say that these are accented non-chord tones and say that the actual chord tones are what I'm marking as passing tones here, leaving us with D, A, C sharp, and F sharp, which is D major 7 or 4/7. We have a transitive progression here. 4 typically wants to go to 7, but here we see it going to 7. Here we see 7 going to 4, which goes against the grain of the cycle of falling fifths, which typically tells you where a chord is going to go, a descending fifth, but here we have it going an ascending fifth. The same voice leading is used though, but it tells a different harmonic narrative, and it just points in towards a different dominant functioning chord that will eventually resolve to a tonic. But after this chord, we have D, G sharp, B, and E. That's E7 over D, which is 5/4/2. Then we have some more subdivision. We have a neighbor tone and escape tone, actually two escape tones. We have C sharp, A, C sharp, and E. That's A major in first inversion, 1/6. We are going to get cramped, so you might have to pull out your magnifying glass. Apologies. Here we have D, F sharp, A, and F sharp. That's another D major triad. Root position, our 4 chord. And then we have B, which is a non-chord tone. B, another non-chord tone. Then we have D, which is actually a chord tone. I'm just on autopilot here, marking it. But yes, this is a chord tone. We don't need to mark it. And G sharp, which makes this a G sharp diminished triad over B. That is 7/6. Notice how we have 4 chords over 2 beats. It's a lot of subdivision going on. And then we have C sharp, E, C sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. I'm going to go and rewrite this 7 chord, make it a little bit smaller so I can afford to write 1/6 on the beat here. This F sharp's a non-chord tone. This A is a chord tone. Kind of turns it into like a 6 chord in root position, but I don't really think it's super important. We're getting close to a cadence. It's starting to get contrapuntal. That's what I really think is happening here. We then have D, A, F sharp, and B. It's B minor 7 over D. Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. This E is a non-chord tone. This G sharp's a non-chord tone. This E is an anticipation. This spells E major, E, G sharp, E, and B, which is our 5 chord, leading us to our perfect authentic cadence in the key of A, where we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our tonic triad. Okay, looking ahead, we have a little less activity going on in the next phrase. It still ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major. So A, E, A, and C sharp, another A major chord, no need to reanalyze. A, E, B, and C sharp. I think this is another tonic triad, just with an accented non-chord tone. We also have a passing 7th in the bass here when the C sharp gets resolved to, so just some counterpoint going on here. But if we have the G sharp, the E, the C sharp, and the E, that's like a passing C sharp minor chord in second inversion, but I don't really think it contributes too much to the chord progression. The bass is moving, which typically occurs over chord changes, not always, but the majority of the time. Let's look at what the next chord is. So the next chord is F sharp, A, D, and F sharp, which is D major in first inversion. 3 can go to 4. I will mark that as a 3-6-4 chord. Why not? You don't need to be this granular in your analysis. Typically speaking, passing chords like this, they don't have the same weight, especially when only 2 voices are involved. Pardon me, but I'm going to mark it here because the chord on the other side is a logical destination for a 3 chord, which is 4. 3 go into 4. It's like a mid-tier normative progression. 3, it's an adjacent harmony. Those chord progressions are seen with frequency, 4 going to 5, 7 going to 1. We see adjacent chord progressions with frequency. 3 going to 4 is up there with the more common ones. So here we have it. We have a passing 7th here in the tenor, the alto, and then we have G sharp, B, and E, which is E major over G sharp. That is 5-6. This is a 4-6 chord, not a 5-6 chord. Let me just go ahead and rewrite that. 3-6-4 in parentheses, 4-6, 5-6. Then we have some passing tones going on in the lower 3 voices, A, C sharp, A, and E. That's our good old tonic triad, A major. And then we have B, D, G sharp, and E. This is E7 over B, which is 5-4-3, followed by neighbor tone in the alto and a late 7th. Actually, the 7th is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. With the B, the D, the F sharp, and the D, that is kind of like a passing 2 chord. Let's see what chords on the other side. We have E sharp, G sharp, B, and C sharp. That's C sharp 7 over E. That's a secondary dominant 5-6-5 of 6, because C sharp's the dominant of F sharp, and F sharp is our 6. I'm not sure I want to be that granular. This feels more like a late 7th, and this F sharp feels more like a neighbor tone to me. It doesn't really feel as much like a chord progression as this chord right here. Maybe that's just my personal bias, but also the fact that the bass isn't moving also contributes to this chord not feeling, or this passing figure not feeling as chordal, or as much of a contribution to the chord progression. That isn't to suggest that the bass always has to move, but the bass is often a factor in terms of determining whether or not a chord progression is happening over a subdivision of the beat. But afterwards we have C sharp, G sharp, E sharp, and B. That's like taking this chord and putting it in root position and adding a 7th. So we could just change the figured bass there. It's not often that we get a passing chord that respells the chord and the chord is entirely intact on the 2nd 8th note of the beat. So I think those are worth marking, at least for my own interest in the chords and how Bach respells them, because a lot of the times we get an incomplete chord where an important contextual tone is left out, like a 5th in a diminished chord or a 3rd in a major or a minor chord. But on the other side of the progression, we have F sharp, A, C sharp, and A. It's our good old F sharp minor chord. That's our 6th chord. We also have some passing tones, a passing 7th in the bass and a passing tone in the melody, leaving us with E, A, C sharp, and G sharp. It's like a passing tonic 7th chord, not super important to the progression. Then we have D, A, D, and F sharp. That is a 4 chord D major in root position, passing 7th in the bass, B, B, D, and G sharp. It's G sharp diminished over B, which is 7/6, and our perfect authentic cadence A, E, A, and C sharp, our tonic triad A major. It's always interesting to see a 4/7/1 progression in an authentic cadence rather than a 2/5/1 or just a 5/1 in general. Okay, looking ahead, we are getting kind of an interesting phrase. It's an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor that kind of feels like a submediate cadence where the F sharp minor is kind of sprung in on us at the end. This phrase proportionately is not very long. The next two phrases are relatively short when paired together with one another. They're only like 5 beats long, or 6 beats if you include the cadential chord. And both of the phrases share that length. So it's interesting over short phrases when a modulation occurs. It's not always clear. Sometimes it almost feels like the secondary dominant is what's causing the modulation, but we'll see when we get to it. We have A, E, and C sharp. That's another tonic triad, A major. We then have a passing tone in the bass before we get C sharp, A, E, and C sharp. That's A major over C sharp. We'll just change the figure bass to reflect first inversion. Then we have another passing tone in the bass. We have E, G sharp, E, and C sharp. Definitely a bit of a deceptive progression here. It feels like we're going to go to a 5 chord, but we actually go to 3/6. It's like a substitution for 5 C sharp minor, especially over E. It's basically an E major chord. We then have passing tones in the inner voices, which sort of hint at the idea of F sharp minor. We have E, A, F sharp, and C sharp. It's like a passing 6/7 chord, and actually 3 wants to go there, so maybe I will say that in passing that is happening, like a 6/4/3 chord. The bass is functioning kind of like a pedal here, so do take the figured bass with a grain of salt. This is more just like a passing 6 chord that happens to have its 7th being held over in the bass. We then have on this beat here, sorry, I occupied way too much real estate here. There's a beat that happens 6/4/3. We then have E, B, G sharp, and B. That's a 5 chord, E major, and with a delayed passing 7th in the bass and a passing tone in the alto. I think this is where we modulate to the key of F sharp minor over the subtonic 7th. We're not really left with a lot of time to establish a normative chord progression, because what we have here is subtonic 7th going to C sharp, B, E sharp, and C. That's C sharp 7. It's incomplete, but 7 going to 5 is not a progression that we see very often. Subtonic 7th already has sort of its own implications as starting a cycle of falling fifths, because it really wants to go to 3. It is a stable chord, but it also has like a pseudo-dominant function. It doesn't contain the leading tone, but 1 going to subtonic 7th going to 1 is a stable progression that brings you from 1 back to 1 again through a chord that is stable. It's almost like a 4 chord in a way, because it's a stable chord that also wants to go to 1. I think that has to do with the fact that it is adjacent to 1, but on the other side of the 1 chord, unlike a 2 chord, which doesn't have the same thing. Like approaching the tonic from above is not as I guess common as approaching the tonic from below in this way. So this is definitely on the fence in terms of like where the modulation is occurring. I think this is as early as the modulation is that can occur, but to me, typically in a phrase like this, I would say the modulation would occur after the dominant. This would function like a secondary dominant, and then the next iteration of that chord is typically the key that we're modulating to, but that's our cadence. So we can't modulate on the cadence unless I guess we were continuing in the key of F sharp, which we really aren't. We're going to go to A major in the next phrase. So we're in kind of a bind here because the phrase ends at an awkward position from an analytical standpoint, at least from my previous experience. So I think just with these short phrases, you have to concede with some analysis that isn't necessarily as strong or as comforting in terms of its normative qualities, which is what we're looking for in an analysis to help paint the narrative of like the direction of where the chords are going. 7 going to 5/7. Is anything wrong with that? No, there's nothing wrong with that, but there is some cross relations going on here, I believe. We have an E major chord here, and we have a C sharp major chord where there is this relationship of E versus E sharp. So that does create kind of an angular sound. Maybe that's what Bach is going for. Bach is also constrained to the melody, right? He has to make it function, a functional chord progression or a progression fit within the confines of an already composed melody. So yeah, there's lots to take into consideration, but I think I've talked at length about it. Here we have this A is a passing tone, this F sharp is a neighbor tone. There's kind of this idea of a 1-6-4 chord going on here over the bass, and I might include, yeah, you know what, I'm just going to be consistent and put it there as a passing chord, or less of a passing chord, more of a subdivided chord. I like that, a subdivided chord. And then we get C sharp, G sharp, F, which becomes an on-chord tone, and C sharp. But we know what's being implied here is just a 5 chord in root position. We could put a little bracket, maybe even instead, I just had a little idea here because the 1-6-4 chord is happening during a subdivision, maybe a little hashed bracket here, because the 1-6 chord is not happening with the same metric emphasis that it typically has. It's usually 1-6-4-5 over 2 separate beats. Here they're sharing a beat, and the 1 gets a weaker position, which is interesting. And then we have F sharp minor, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in this context. And we are moving to the next phrase, which is equally as interesting. We are moving to the key of A major, but the end of the phrase is what I'm calling an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. And if you've watched my videos in the past, you know that I've been trying to popularize, or I guess coin this term, subdominant cadence, where it doesn't necessarily feel like we've modulated to the key of the subdominant, but there really isn't vocabulary that has been made conventional in terms of analyzing this music that describes a cadence of 1 going to 4. You can fit it under an umbrella. You could say that it fits a certain narrative more so than others. I'm making the argument it's more like an authentic cadence or an imperfect authentic cadence than anything else, but you know, it feels like it's going from 1 to 4, and that's one of these interesting sounds that pops up every once in a while in Bach, and I'm calling it a subdominant cadence because it feels like we're cadencing it on 4 rather than modulating. But I think both are accurate analyses depending on your outlook and depending on how you hear it. So here we have another F sharp chord, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A, F sharp minor to be more specific. This is where we're modulating back to the key of A major. It's now our 6th chord again, passing 7th in the bass. And then we have D, B, G sharp, and B. This is G sharp diminished over D again. We're seeing another 7-6-4 chord. And then we have 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm. That typically means there's a chord. Virtually always, if all 4 voices are moving, we're seeing the harmonic rhythm subdivided. So C sharp, A, and C sharp. That's our tonic triad in first inversion, A major. Then we have B, A, B, and D. A very interesting chord here. This is B minor 7. We're seeing 2 7 chords in the middle of a phrase is very interesting, but this phrase is actually very short, so it's the middle, but we're also nearing the cadence. And one of the interesting things that happens in these subdominant cadences is that it feels like we're cadencing and arriving on the tonic, which then subverts our expectations and becomes the dominant in the context of an imperfect authentic cadence of the key of the subdominant. Especially with this G natural here, we don't always get the lowered 7th scale degree to give us that additional context, but here we are. It still feels like we're in the key of A major, though that's just me. But here, this E is an on-chord tone, this G sharp's an on-chord tone, this F sharp's a chord tone, so we can mark it. So we do get this idea of a passing 5 chord, or even more specifically, a passing 5-7 chord. I'm sure I could write a little bit more neatly than that. 5-7. We have an E7 chord here, E, G sharp, B, and D. It's even spelled in alphabetical order, which is Actually, I'm not going to make the claim that it's rare. It feels rare. Like, intuitively, I feel like ascending, like root position chords that are actually in order of the thirds is not the most common voicing we see. But that would be an interesting statistic to go in and take apart the analysis and see what proportion of spellings we get and what the most common one is. I'd imagine they'd be pretty evenly distributed because it's so heavily context based, but maybe one would emerge more common than the others. But here we have A, E, B, and C sharp. This B is a 9/8 suspension over the bass being carried over the alto. It is our tonic triad in root position, and we are now, actually we're going to stay in the key of A major right until the very end. We have a passing tone in the bass. We have C sharp, A, and C sharp. That is our tonic again in first inversion. This G does typically spell a different story. If you've seen my analyses in the past, you'll see, like, if I see, or you'll note that if I see this subtonic subtonic seventh, I'd say that instead of 1/6, this is actually 5/6 of 4. Just because this G is telling us where we're going to go, it changes the function, or it changes the sound that this A is trying to portray. But because it's so close in proximity to the cadence, I have no problem calling it in A major chord over C sharp. In this case, we're going to call it 5/6 of in the key of D as well, with a passing seventh in the alto and this delayed passing tone in the melody. It's mostly context driven. I'm torn between the idea of saying the modulation happens over the first iteration of A, because this is the first common chord we see, or if it happens over the second iteration of A. And I feel like it's more important to analyze it over the second iteration, because if we see the same chord twice, what reason do we have to think that the modulation happened any earlier? It's the same chord, just respelled. So that's my logic. Whether or not it agrees with your analysis, I'll leave that up to you, but I think both are accurate. If you wanted to say that we modulated to the key of D over here, I think that's totally fine as well. They're both conveying what's eventually going to happen, and if I was grading an assignment like this, I wouldn't mark it wrong. But then, of course, we cadence on D major, D, A, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in the key of D major. And typically speaking, I would analyze this as the 4 chord in the key of A. We would immediately revert our idea of being in the key of D right back into being in the key of A. But in this case, we're followed by a B minor chord, D, B, F sharp, and B, which in the key of D major is kind of like a D major chord, right? We have D, D, and F sharp, but in the same way that this 3 chord right here, this C sharp minor over E, feels like we're going to 5 from our 1 chord. Here we have 1, and it feels like we're going to 6, or it feels like we're going to another 1 chord, but the only thing that changes is the note in the melody. So it feels like we have a pedal D major over with a B on top of it. But when we go from D major to B minor, we have really no reason to think that we've moved to the key of A major from a harmonic standpoint. No, sorry, what I'm trying to say is that after hearing B minor after D, there's no reason to believe that from a harmonic standpoint we've moved to the key of A major, not D major. We're currently in the key of D major, but in the process of moving to the key of A major, and this B minor chord is 2 in first inversion. And this E is a passing tone, this C sharp is an accented, or I guess it's a syncopation, creating some type of suspension over the next beat, or not. Then we have another passing tone here and another passing tone here. That leaves us with E, C sharp, G sharp, and C sharp. That is C sharp major over G sharp. I think Bach is starting a bout of ascending. Well, we have an adjacent progression here, and moving from one chord to the next just means that we have another way to traverse the scale. It's kind of like a reset of the cycle. Typically, we would expect 3 to go to 6, but here, or sorry, no, I was just going off on a tangent that wouldn't have made sense. this is a 2 chord, not a 6 chord, because we're now in the key of A major. Here we have F sharp, C sharp, A, and D. That's D major 7 over F sharp, which is 4, 6, 5. So we're getting a bout of ascending adjacent progressions, which Bach does from time to time. We do get strings of adjacent chords. But the way that they're spelled and with all of the inner movements, it doesn't feel like Bach's just taking the same spelling and, you know, planing the chords, kind of like how like Debussy would do. But here we have, you know, a progression that involves contrary movement in some of the voices, and we're still getting an ascending progression. It's mostly dictated by the bass, but regardless, this G sharp's a passing tone, this B's like a delayed neighbor tone, this B is a neighbor tone, and this D right here is still a chord tone being held over, but this adjacent harmony is going to stop here. Instead of getting a 5, 6, we get G sharp, B, B, and D, which is a root position 7 chord. Also to note that Bach avoids doubling the leading tone in chords that have a leading tone. Here he doubles the 3rd, sometimes he doubles the 5th, but I think the majority of the time he doubles the 3rd. That's kind of the best practice, if there was one, if there was a best practice writing in this sort of Bach style. And on the other side of this 7 chord, we do get a tonic, A, C sharp, A, and C sharp, another one of these interesting double root, double 3rd spellings. I think actually this is the point. I did not talk about the cadence. This is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E major, and I think my sensors are going off about a modulation happening because we have a D sharp here, and typically the modulation happens in and around this D sharp, whether it's on the other side or whether it's on this side. Now typically if it was on the other side, this would be functioning as a secondary dominant, and on the other side we have our tonic or some other chord that would then go to the tonic, but here I think is our common chord. We have A major, which is our root position 4 chord in the key of A major as well. Over these passing tones here, all the voices have passing tones. We have B, D sharp, G sharp, and B. Another one of these really interesting 3 chords. This is no longer 7 in the key of A, but 3, 6 in the key of E. A bit of a deceptive progression because 4 typically doesn't go to 3. We've seen 3 go to 4, but 4 going to 3 takes us further away from the dominant, which is just interesting. But sometimes we do see 4 go to 3. But what I also see happening here is sometimes we see chords that are ascending. It's not even necessarily subdivided, but in the same way that we see like 1, 7, 6, 1, 6, here we might be seeing 4, 3, 6, 4, 6. Let's see if we get that. We get C sharp, E, F sharp, and A. So I think actually what is happening here is this is a 4, 6 chord, but this F sharp is an accented non-chord tone, and it's this E that we're looking at, C sharp, E, E, and A, but we do get the 7th introduced here, and if we look at the entire chord, we have A, E, E, and G sharp, which is kind of like a root position 4, 7 chord, but we lose the 3rd of the chord, which is the most important tone for the context of knowing what flavor of chord this is. So I'm not going to mark it as having changed its structure here. This is purely contrapuntal, even though that the majority of the context is there, it's not entirely there. But yeah, so we have 3 going to 4. This is this subdivision is just bridging the gap between 2 4 chords, one in root position and one in first inversion. On the other side we have B, B, D sharp, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord, B major, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get E, B, E, and G sharp. Finally, our tonic triad in the key of in E major. I say finally as if we've really spent a great deal of time with the you know, like listening at this point, but we haven't. You know, it's only 4 beats, so it's not even really that long of a phrase. I've just talked about the chords for a long time. Lots to talk about in this chorale because of all the subdivisions, and with subdivisions comes complications. You know, most subdivisions, mo problems. But here we have a passing 7th in the bass, this F sharp here, and this A, F sharp, B, F sharp, and A is kind of like a passing 5, 4, 3 chord, but again, we don't have the 3rd, so I'm not going to analyze it on the page. And this is a 1, 6 chord, not a 1 chord. We then have E, B, G sharp, and B. That is our root position 5, 3 chord, or that is our 1 chord in root position. That's what the 5, 3 means. This D sharp is a passing 7th. I called this F sharp a passing seventh, this D sharp is the passing seventh, this C sharp is a known chord tone, this D sharp is a known chord tone, and then we have C sharp, E, G sharp, and B on the in the key of E. Wait, hold on, did I make a mistake earlier? C sharp, E, oh yeah, no, I did not make a mistake earlier. Yes, this is a G sharp minor chord. C sharp minor, however, is a 6 chord, more specifically a 6-7 chord in the key of E major. And then we have some non-chord tones here. This B is actually a chord tone because it's 6-7. This F sharp is a non-chord tone. This A is a non-chord tone. This D is a non-chord tone. We're left with D sharp, B, F sharp, and A. That's B7 over D sharp, which is 5-6, happening off the harmonic rhythm. So much subdivision in this chorale. Can't recall a chorale that has had this much subdivision in recent memory. Especially, like, look at this first phrase. I look at my viewport. I'm recording through my computer right now, and I can't even make out this text. Hopefully it shows up when it's enlarged if you're watching it in full screen, and if it doesn't, you're just gonna have to rewind the video if you're following along with your own score. I'm very sorry. It's just trying to keep everything on one page and preserve paper when I can. I already print 2 pages so that I can analyze it. This is not my first analysis. I take notes that I then use to guide the analysis here, and then my second read through hopefully catches all of the errors, if not the vast majority of them, which, you know, for all intents and purposes, having done this as frequently as I have, it has led to me catching the majority of the mistakes. But on the other side of this 5-6 chord, we have E, B, F sharp, and G sharp. That's another E major chord with a 9/8 suspension over the bass. We saw a similar figure to this earlier. I think it was in this phrase right here. We had the B carried over. It was a tonic triad with a 9/8 suspension. Even though it's a different rhythmic profile, we have another chord progression that's very similar. And then this G sharp right here, G sharp, B, E, and G sharp, that's a E major over G sharp, and the chord's intact, so I'll mark it. We then have B, B, E, and F sharp. This E, we saw another thing. This is a similar sort of Bach thing where he creates a suspension here, and we get another accented non-chord tone, or it is a suspension, but if we look at this E as an accented non-chord tone as well, we know that 5 is what's being implied. This D sharp is actually the chord tone, and actually when the resolution happens, I guess this is technically a 5-7 chord because the 7th gets introduced at the same time as the resolution, and the bass leaps down an octave, so feels like the chord is actually happening on beat 2 and before we cadence on E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is our tonic triad. And typically when we get perfect authentic cadences in the key of the dominant, and when I say the dominant, I mean in terms of the entire tonality of the chorale, it's typically functioning like our dominant as we move into the tonic key, especially in this part of the chorale, we're in the home stretch, but we get a very deceptive progression afterwards. We go from a root position 5 chord to a root position 4 chord, D, A, D, and F sharp. 5 going to 4 with a neighbor tone in the bass, more specifically a neighboring 7th. But then we have D, B, E, and G sharp. That's E7 over D, which is 5-4-2. And then we get some vocal exchange here between the bass and the tenor. We get B and D swapping places, which takes our 5-4-2 chord and actually turns it into 5-4-3. I think that's kind of interesting. But effectively, if we look at this B as more of an ornament, even though it's a chord tone, we're kind of converging upon this C sharp here. Notice how we're approaching C from below and above, and here from above and below. They're just sort of inverting the same gesture that they're doing. But eventually, the 7th, I feel, does resolve the way it is supposed to our tonic triad in first inversion. C sharp, E, and A, 1-6. This F sharp is a non-chord tone, this C sharp is a chord tone, kind of turns this tonic triad into a 6 chord. I feel like I said something like this before. Right here is where we saw something very similar, where we saw our tonic triad in first inversion leap up to introduce this F here, but the other voices are doing different things, so it's not the exact same, but we've seen a very similar progression. On the other side of this interesting sort of 6 chord that we have in passing, we have E, C natural, F sharp, and A. That's like F sharp to F sharp minor 7 flat 5, which would be a 6/2 diminished chord, kind of borrowing from A minor or melodic minor. But no, this E is an accented non-chord tone. So this D sharp, that's the interesting tone. We have D sharp, C, F sharp, and A, which is D sharp fully diminished 7th. This is a secondary dominant chord, 7/7 of 5, because D sharp's the leading tone to E, and E is our 5. And if you haven't watched any of my very recent videos in relation to this episode, like the last 3 or 4 episodes, I've started to try and write my secondary dominants just like I wrote this one here, as like a vertical fraction rather than a slash, to help in situations like this where I have more space on the other side of the chord, because sometimes we have a chord happening on the beat afterwards, like here, and the vertical slash helps that. But what kind of undoes that is the fact that the line is as long as it is, and I write with as big a text as I do. But regardless, the gesture is supposed to save space. We then have E, B, E, and A, another 4/3 suspension, this time being contributed to the texture by the melody. This is our 5 chord, E major. This A is going to resolve down by step. This A is a neighbor tone. We have E, B, E, and G sharp. That is our 5 chord proper after the resolution. And then this D is enclosing the C here, similar as it does here. We see a very similar pattern, but instead of enclosing... Oh no, they're both C sharps. I don't know what I'm talking about. This C natural is a descending chromatic progression here. I was expecting this to be a B sharp, but it's actually a C natural for this exact reason. It's a secondary dominant or secondary leading tone, fully diminished 7th chord. This D is 7th regardless, and then we conclude with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major with our tonic triad, A, C sharp, E, and A, to close out the chorale. That was a marathon of a chorale. It was not super long, but there was a lot to talk about. There was a lot to unpack, because even though this chorale doesn't proportionately look like a lot on the page, it's a single page, I basically analyzed 2 chorales today because of all the subdivisions. So some of the 2-pagers are shorter than this episode, but wanted to be thorough. This chorale had a lot of harmonic movement going on, and making sure that there were beats that looked like subdivisions that weren't as easily analyzable, making sure that I wasn't really leaving too many stones unturned, and trying to justify my analysis for some of the cases of, like, why is one chord a subdivision and one not, in my opinion, or, you know, why is a subdivision a chord versus one that isn't, in my opinion. And hopefully I was able to achieve that. Not 100% sure if I did, but I feel like I did an okay job. But that pretty much concludes the analysis for today. Not a lot of modulations, but a lot of chord progressions going on over the span of these relatively short phrases. Regardless, if you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Feel free to hit the notification icon. You'll be notified of when my daily upload goes live, and I would love to have you along on the journey. You'll get your daily fix of Bach, your daily fix of analysis, and there are more than 200 chorales left to analyze, so you are looking at a lot of content if this is the type of content you enjoy, and I am very happy to provide it for you. But with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.